Again, familiar text, right? All know the story of the Good Samaritan, probably have from the time of Sunday schools. And when you get to scriptures like this, it's very easy to assume that we know what it means, right? I've heard it 100 times. It's all about this. And I promise you, I am no different. Because as you'll see in just a moment, I started this with the same assumption that most of us have about what the real question is in this text. So yes, even pastors get stuck on cruise control. But I did not end up there. So I'm just going to take you on a little journey that I took this week. And what I learned in the middle of all of the study changed the meaning of the story for me. And I'm hoping to give it maybe a little more depth for you. So we usually begin with the core assumption that the story is about who is my neighbor, right? And most of us treat the lawyer like he's an idiot. But what you may not realize, and what I did not realize, is that the debate over that question had been going on for 200 years already at the time of Jesus, and would continue well into the Middle Ages. So in Greek, the word that's used as neighbor there, its root word just means near, which makes sense, right? And what really got me on that one was finding out that word was like near. And you get to the word when the priest and the Levite pass by on the other side, the word means anti. It literally starts anti-near. They literally make the guy not their neighbor as much as they can on the road. But when it comes to this argument about who counts as a neighbor, there were two primary schools. There was a third one that came along, but the two schools were this kind of universal reading that we are all familiar with. That neighbor, which in the Hebrew doesn't mean near, it just means your fellow, or someone, your neighbor literally, or your fellow, or your friend. But it ultimately points beyond just Israel to every human people, while we'll just edit that out. But it points beyond every human being, since all people bear the image of God. But then there's just the communal reading for it. And the interpreters who do this in Leviticus 19:18 is that the origin of that love your neighbor as yourself. And in the context of the text that comes before it, and a little after, you have this repetition of brother and kinsman and your people. And so they say that you shall love your neighbor means your fellow Israelite. Because that is what has been spoken of just prior to this. Which makes sense, right? Not unsound logic. And then, of course, we have to throw in the other little problem, as yourself. What does that mean? Because it could be translated as like yourself, right? So the common interpretation, as yourself, is to just seek another's good in the way that you seek your own good. So you do good for others in the same way you do good for yourself. But the alternative, if you can say, like you. So love your neighbor who is like you. So this gets all sorts of fun when you read the rabbis arguing about this, because it can apply to a neighbor who is just morally or socially like you, or your neighbor who is your equal. And there was one rabbi who was like, no, this just means somebody who's right with the law, because the Lord punishes the wicked, and so we shouldn't seek their good, even if they're living right next door or they are an Israelite. So this debate, this question, started long before Jesus and continued way after. And so Jesus, when he gives his answer to this question, does what Jesus always does. He tells a story. Now, I don't know if you know this or not, but this story was not made up on the spot. This story is an echo from the Old Testament. It's from 2 Chronicles. And you have the story where, a certain man, which I love in this one, because you have a certain man is going from Jerusalem to Jericho. He's stripped and beaten and left half dead. And this certain man, this phrase keeps popping up. We never know exactly who he is. We don't know if he is a Jew. We don't know if he's a Samaritan. We don't know if he's from somebody else, if he's just a merchant who's traveling the region. He's just a certain man. Even the priest who comes along is just a certain priest. We don't know if he is a priest of the temple in Jerusalem. We only know that he is a priest, and we all know that there were many religions, and therefore many priests of very many different gods in the area at the time. It only gets specific when he mentions a Levite. It's not a certain Levite, it is a Levite. So we don't know who this certain man is. And I think that's important because Jesus is saying it doesn't matter who he is, it's a human being left half dead in a ditch. And then, of course, we know the Samaritan comes along, and the actions that the Samaritan takes is the same exact actions that the Samaritans took towards Israel when they were at war. The northern kingdom of Israel became known as Samaria, and the southern kingdom of Judah, where Jerusalem is, we're in a war because God was mad at Judah's king Ahaz for idolatry and human sacrifice. So he sent the Samaritans, the northern kingdom. And in one battle, they captured thousands of Judean prisoners. And they were going to sell them into slavery, basically. But a prophet named Oded rebuked the army for that cruelty with this sentence: surely do you not have transgressions of your own against the Lord your God? Do you really want to pile on? So the Samaritans left the captives and the spoil in front of the officers of the assembly, as they were called. And those men, it says this, arose, took the captives, they clothed all the naked ones from the spoils, they gave them clothes and sandals, they fed them, gave them drink, anointed them with oil, tended their wounds, and put all of the feeble ones on the backs of their donkeys to take them back home to Judah. These are exact same things the Samaritan does to the man in the ditch. He tends his wounds, anointed with oil and wine, so cleans his wounds, puts him on the back of his donkey, takes him to an inn where he is fed and cared for. So Jesus is literally calling to mind this old story when he tells this new one. Because where did they take them? Not just anywhere in Judea. They took them to Jericho. Where was the man heading? To Jericho. So Jesus isn't just giving another illustration. He is reminding this lawyer of Judah's own story by having the Samaritan do the exact same things that Samaria did in 2 Chronicles. And then he very quietly brings a litany of laws into play. Laws that are found repeatedly within the Torah and within the prophets. You hear it echoed all over in Psalms, where you get things like the Lord watches over the strangers, he upholds the widow and the fatherless. So this is a core personality trait of God. But even more so, he brings up that how Israel is commanded to protect the stranger, the orphan, and the widow, because they know exactly what it means to be helpless and exposed because of their own slavery in Egypt. Repeatedly. The best example from Exodus 23:9. You know the heart of a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. So Jesus is bringing up these laws. Because remember, love your neighbor as yourself only appears once in the Old Testament. In Leviticus 19:18. More than 37 times they're told to take care of the stranger in their midst. So that doesn't even count the widows and the orphans and the poor. And then here's how we know that the lawyer heard every last subtle suggestion Jesus was giving. He answers with the phrase, the one who showed mercy. Now, if you go back to when the Samaritan saw the guy on the side of the road, it said that he saw him and he had compassion on him. And I want to point this out for two reasons. First of all, it's one of my favorite Greek words. The root word of that word compassion is splonchnismai. Right? It's just fun to say splonchnismai. And it means literally guts. It means your innards. So the Samaritan saw the man in the ditch, and he was gut-wrenched. That's moved by compassion. But the lawyer, because sometimes you'll get the lawyer's answer being translated as the one who showed compassion. But it says the one who showed mercy, eleos. And in the Septuagint, and if you don't know what the Septuagint is, it's the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So they had 70, that's why you get the name Septuagint, 70 Jewish scholars who translated the Hebrew into Greek. And when that word eleos appears in the Septuagint, which is 170 times, by the way, it is used in place of the word chesed, which we often translate as loving kindness. But it really means more of a steadfast covenant love. So mercy, in this case, is chesed, and it is defined as faithfulness to God's covenant. So Jesus is basically reminding them that you're supposed to care for the poor and the widow and the outcast and the stranger because you were slaves in Egypt. You know what it is to be laid bare in the world, so don't become the kind of people who walk by when somebody else is. The vulnerable don't become your neighbor because they belong to your group. They become your neighbor because their need reveals whether mercy actually lives in you. Whether covenant faithfulness lives in you. And so a neighbor isn't a category as much as it is a summons. So in case you missed it the first two times, mercy is faithfulness to God's covenant. And so the injured man, no matter who he is, Jew or stranger or alien or sojourner, no matter who he is or where he's from, he is everyone's neighbor for the very reason that he is in need of mercy. And what's funny is 2 verses before the love your neighbor as yourself in Leviticus, you get a command from God in Leviticus 19:16 that says, "You shall not stand over the blood of your neighbor." So, in case that needs a little translation, remember, in Leviticus especially, blood and life are equal things. The life of the flesh is in the blood. So you shall not stand over and watch the life flow out of your neighbor. Or even better, you shall not stand by idly when a human life is in danger. And so mercy then becomes faithfulness to God's covenant made visible in how we treat the vulnerable. And so we come to what I think may be a new center of this story. A new crux. Not who is my neighbor. Because Jesus says it's about more than that. It's about mercy. It's about how we treat others, especially those who are defenseless and powerless. About whether or not we're more interested in the specifics of the rules or so worried about being right about everything, or so stuck on what we want truth to be that we are willing to stand idly by while other human beings are dying. Jesus is saying if you want to argue about the law, then that argument must be informed by the whole law. And that is mercy and how we treat others. And if we think this stuff doesn't go on nowadays, if we think we're way above and beyond the lawyer or the priest or the Levite, who, by the way, if both the priest and the Levite were working at the temple in Jerusalem, they were well within the law for doing what they did. Because if they think the guy is dead, it says in the law, if a priest comes across a dead body and comes into contact with it, he has 7 days of absolution rites to do before he can go back and do work in the temple. So they think he's dead. They're trying not to violate the law by touching a dead body. Which I think is very subtle of Jesus too, right? Again, no. This is a human life at stake. Eventually the rabbis would come along and say, when a human life is at stake, the whole of the law is suspended. but I digress. We do these things nowadays. We just split the church over part of it. And now, I don't know if you've read this or seen this news, the Southern Baptist Convention has been taking votes, and they are going to punish churches that have women pastors. In 2026. Because again, it's not about who is doing good or who is preaching the gospel well. It's about the letter of the law. Paul's law. And to choose that kind of path, to choose this thing as your life goal, to be technically rigorous and biblically literate, but morally useless, that is by definition a sin. It's a direct violation of our covenant with the Lord, who watches over strangers and widows and orphans with special attention. So if I had to sum up this story in a different way, because we skipped the first question the lawyer asked. Does anybody remember what it is? Close. What must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus' response is basically, throughout this whole story, stop using the law to protect yourself from the claims of mercy. And start becoming the kind of person whose faithfulness to God can be seen in how you treat the wounded.